1. The mysterious dacha. During my walks around Simiez, I noticed a lonely dacha perched on a steep mountainside. There wasn't even a road leading to it. It was surrounded by a high fence with a single low gate that was always tightly closed. Not a single bush or tree was visible above the fence. Surrounding the dacha were bare ledges of yellowish rocks. Here and there, stunted junipers and stunted crooked mountain pines grew among them. What kind of fantasy came into someone's head to settle on this wild, bare cliff? And does anyone even live there? I thought as I wandered around the dacha. I had never seen anyone emerge from there. My curiosity was so great that I confess I tried to peer into the courtyard of the mysterious dwelling by climbing the rocks above. But the dacha was so situated that, no matter where I entered, I could only see a small corner of the yard. It was as empty and uncultivated as the surrounding countryside. However, after several days of observation, I noticed an elderly woman in black walking through the courtyard. This intrigued me even more. If people live there, then they must maintain at least some kind of connection with the outside world. Well, at least go to the market for groceries. I began making inquiries among my acquaintances and finally satisfied my curiosity. True, no one knew for certain who the inhabitants of the dacha were, but one acquaintance informed me that Professor Wagner was rumored to live there. Professor Wagner! This was enough to completely captivate my attention to the dacha. I absolutely wanted to see this extraordinary man who had created such a stir with his inventions. But how? I literally began spying on the dacha. I felt it was wrong, yet I continued my observations, sitting for hours at different times of the day and even at night behind a juniper bush not far from the dacha. They say that if a person relentlessly pursues one goal, then sooner or later he will achieve it. One early morning, just as dawn was breaking, I suddenly heard the treasured door in the high fence creak. I became all tensed, and held my breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The door opened. A tall man with a ruddy face, a light brown beard, and a drooping mustache stepped out and looked around carefully. Of course, it was him, Professor Wagner. Satisfied that no one was around, he slowly began to climb, reached a small mountain platform, and began performing some exercises there that were completely incomprehensible to me. The platform was scattered with stones of varying sizes. Professor Wagner approached them and attempted to lift them. Then, stepping carefully, moved to a new spot and began lifting them again. But they were all so large and heavy that even a professional athlete would have struggled to move them. What a strange amusement, I thought. And suddenly, I was so astonished that I couldn't suppress an involuntary exclamation. Something incredible had happened. Professor Wagner approached a huge rock fragment, taller than a man, grabbed it by its protruding sharp edge, and lifted it with the ease of a piece of cardboard. Stretching out his arm, he began to move the rock fragment in arcs. I didn't know what to think. Either Professor Wagner possessed supernatural powers, but then why couldn't he lift relatively small stones? I didn't have time to finish my thought before Professor Wagner's new trick amazed me even more. Professor Wagner threw the boulder upward, like a small pebble, and it soared, rising to a height of 20 meters. I anxiously awaited the boulder's impact with a thud, but the fragment fell back rather slowly. I counted 10 seconds before the boulder sank back down, and when it was about a man's height above the ground, Professor Wagner reached out, caught it, and held it steady, his hand not even trembling. "Ho, ho, ho!" Professor Wagner laughed merrily, his bass voice low, and flung the boulder far away from him. After flying parallel to the ground for a while, it suddenly veered sharply, plummeting and shattered with a terrible roar. "Ho, ho, ho!" Professor Wagner laughed again and made an extraordinary leap. Rising about 4 meters, he flew along the platform toward me. He obviously misjudged his jump, because the same thing happened to him as with the boulder. He suddenly began falling rapidly, and if not for the slope onto which he landed, Professor Wagner likely would have been killed. He fell not far from me, on the other side of a juniper bush, groaning and cursing, clutching his knee. He stroked the bruised area, tried to stand, and groaned again. After some hesitation, I decided to reveal my presence and give him assistance. "Are you badly hurt? Should I help you?" I asked, emerging from the bush. Apparently, my appearance didn't surprise the professor. At least, he didn't show any sign of it. "No, thank you. I can walk on my own," he replied calmly, and made another attempt to stand. His face was contorted with pain. He even leaned back. His leg was rapidly swelling at the knee. It was obvious that he couldn't get up without assistance. And I began to act decisively. "Let's go before the pain weakens you any more," I said, and lifted him up. He obeyed. His injured leg ached with every movement. We slowly climbed the steep slope. I was practically carrying Professor Wagner on my back, and I was exhausted under the weight of his rather heavy body. But at the same time, I was extremely pleased that I had thus had the opportunity not only to see, but also to meet Professor Wagner and visit his home. But perhaps, when he reached the gate, he would thank me and not let me in. This thought troubled me as we approached the high fence of his dacha. But he said nothing, and we crossed the sacred line. Indeed, he could hardly say anything. He was in very bad shape. From the pain and concussion, he almost lost consciousness. I, too, was collapsing from exhaustion, and yet, before leading him into the house, I managed to cast an inquisitive glance over my shoulder at the yard. The yard was quite large. In the center stood some kind of device similar to Moran's apparatus. In the depths of the yard, in the ground, a large round hole lined with thick glass was visible. Around this hole, from it to the house, and in several other directions, metal arcs protruded from the ground, located at a distance of 1/2 meter from each other. I didn't have time to see anything else. An elderly woman in black came out of the house to meet us, his housekeeper, as I later learned. We put Professor Wagner to bed. 2. The Enchanted Circle. Professor Wagner was in a terrible state. He was breathing heavily, his eyes closed, delirious. Could this brilliant machine, Professor Wagner's brain, really perish from a concussion? I thought with concern. The patient raved about mathematical formulas and groaned from time to time. The bewildered housekeeper stood helplessly, only repeating, "What will happen now? Good heavens, what will happen now?" I had to give the professor first aid and look after the sick man. Only on the second day, towards morning, did Professor Wagner come to his senses. He opened his eyes and looked at me with a completely conscious expression. "Thank you," he said weakly. I gave him something to drink, and he nodded, asking me to leave him alone. Exhausted by the worries of the previous day and a sleepless night, I finally decided to leave the patient alone, and went out into the courtyard to breathe in the fresh morning air. The unknown apparatus, standing in the middle of the courtyard, caught my attention again. I approached it and extended my hand. "Don't go! Stop!" I heard the housekeeper's muffled, frightened voice behind me, and at that very moment I felt my hand suddenly become unusually heavy, as if a huge weight had been hung on it, yanking me down with such force that I fell to the ground. An invisible weight crushed my wrist. With great effort, I pulled my hand back. It was sore, and read. The housekeeper stood next to me and shook her head sadly. "And how can you? Is it even possible? You better not walk around the yard, otherwise you'll get completely flattened." Without understanding anything, I returned to the house and put a compress on my sore arm. When the professor awoke again, he looked quite cheerful. Clearly this man had an unusually healthy constitution. "What is this?" he asked, pointing to my hand. I explained it to him. "You were in great danger," he said. I really wanted to hear from Professor Wagner an explanation of all the extraordinary things I had experienced, but I refrained from asking questions, not wanting to disturb the patient. That same evening, Professor Wagner, having asked to move his bed to the window, began to talk about what had so occupied me. "Science," he began without preamble, "studies the manifestations of natural forces and establishes scientific laws, but knows very little about the essence of these forces. We say electricity, gravity. We study their properties and use them for our own purposes, but they reveal the ultimate secrets of their nature to us only reluctantly, and so we use them far from fully. Electricity, in this regard, has proved more pliable. We have enslaved this force, mastering it, and made it work for us. We move it from place to place, accumulate it, and use it as needed. But gravity is truly the most unyielding force. We must come to terms with it, adapting to it rather than adapting it to our needs. If we could change gravity, control it at will, accumulate it like electricity, what a powerful tool we would have. Mastering this unruly force has long been my desire." "And you took possession of it," I exclaimed, beginning to understand everything that had happened. "Yes, I've mastered it. I've found a way to regulate gravity at will. You saw my first success." "Oh, successes come at a great price hike," Professor Wagner sighed, rubbing his bruised knee. "As an experiment, I reduced the force of gravity in a small area near my house, and you saw how easily I lifted a boulder. I did this by increasing the force of gravity in a small area of my yard. You nearly paid with your life for your curiosity, coming close to my vicious circle. Oh, look," he continued, pointing out the window. "There's a flock of birds flying towards the dacha. Maybe at least one of them will fly over the zone of increased gravity." He fell silent, and I watched with excitement as the birds approached. There they were, flying right over the yard. And suddenly, one of them fell to the ground like a stone and didn't even break, but turned into a stain that covered the ground with a layer probably no thicker than tissue paper. "Did you give it out?" I shuddered at the thought that the same fate could befall me. "Yes," he guessed my thought. "You would be crushed under the weight of your own head and turned into a pancake." And, smiling again, he continued, "Fema, my housekeeper, says I've invented an excellent way to preserve food from stray cats. Don't kill them completely, but make sure their paws stick to you. They won't come back again." "Yes," he said after a pause, "there are cats even more mischievous and dangerous, two-beaked ones, armed not with claws and teeth, but with cannons and machine guns. Imagine what a defensive measure conquering gravity would be. I could create a barrier zone along the borders of states, and no enemy would cross it. Airplanes would fall like stones, like this bird. Moreover, even shells wouldn't be able to fly past this barrier zone. The opposite could be done. Deprive an advancing enemy of gravity, and soldiers would leap high into the air at the slightest movement, dangling helplessly in the air. But all this is nothing compared to what I have achieved.
I have found a way to reduce gravity over the entire surface of the globe, except at the poles. And how will you achieve this? I'll make the globe spin faster, that's all, Professor Wagner replied, as if he were talking about a spindle. Increase the speed of the Earth's rotation? I could not help but exclaim. Yes, I'll increase its speed, and then the centrifugal force will begin to increase, and all objects on Earth will become increasingly lighter. If you don't mind staying with me for a few more days, with pleasure. I will begin the experiment as soon as I get up, and you will see many interesting things.
3. Spins. Within a few days, Professor Wagner had recovered completely, save for a slight limp. He would retreat for long periods to his underground laboratory in the corner of the courtyard, leaving his home library at my disposal. But he didn't invite me into the laboratory. One day, when I was sitting in the library, Professor Wagner came in, very animated, and shouted to me from the doorway, "It's spinning! I've got my apparatus in motion, and now we'll see what happens next." I expected something extraordinary to happen, but hours passed, a day passed, and nothing changed. "Wait," the professor smiled into his drooping mustache. "Centrifugal force increases proportionally to the square of the velocity, and the Earth is a pretty good spinning top. You won't be able to get it going anytime soon." The next morning, as I rose from my bed, I felt a certain lightness. To test myself, I lifted the chair. It felt significantly lighter than usual. Apparently, centrifugal force had taken effect. I went out onto the veranda and sat down with a book in my hands. The shadow of the pole fell on the book. I couldn't help but notice that the shadow was moving quite quickly. What could that mean? It was as if the sun were moving faster across the sky. "Aha, you noticed," I heard Professor Wagner's voice, watching me. "The Earth is spinning faster, and the cycle of day and night is getting shorter." "What happens next?" I asked, puzzled. "We'll see," the professor replied. The sun set 2 hours earlier than usual that day. "I can imagine the stir this event caused throughout the world," I said to the professor. "I'd be interested to know." "You can find out about this in my office. There's a radio receiver there," Professor Wagner replied. I hurried into the office and could see that the population of the entire globe was in an extraordinary state of agitation. But this was only the beginning. The Earth's rotation was increasing. A day was now only 4 hours long. "Now all bodies located at the equator have lost 1/40th of their weight," said the professor. "Why only at the equator?" I asked. "There the Earth's gravity is weaker, and the radius of rotation is larger, which means that the centrifugal force is stronger." Scientists had already realized the impending danger. The great migration of peoples from equatorial regions to higher latitudes where centrifugal force was less had begun. But for now, the lighter weight was even beneficial. Trains could lift enormous loads. A low-powered motorcycle engine was sufficient to pull a large passenger airplane, and travel speeds increased. People suddenly became lighter and stronger. I myself experienced this ever-increasing lightness, an amazingly pleasant feeling. The radio soon began bringing even more dismal news. Trains began derailing more and more frequently on inclines and curves, though without any significant catastrophic consequences. The cars, even falling downhill, did not crash. The wind, raising clouds of dust that no longer settled to the ground, turned into a hurricane. News of terrible floods came from everywhere. When the rotation speed increased 17-fold, objects and people at the equator became completely weightless. One evening, I heard some terrifying news on the radio. In equatorial Africa and America, there had been several cases of people deprived of gravity falling upwards under the influence of ever-increasing centrifugal force. Soon, more terrifying news arrived. At the equator, people were starting to suffocate.
The centrifugal force tears away the air shell of the globe, which was attached to the Earth by the force of gravity, the professor explained to me calmly. But then we'll suffocate too, I asked Professor Wagner worriedly. He shrugged. We are well prepared for all changes. But why did you do all this? This is a global catastrophe, the death of civilization, I couldn't help but exclaim. Professor Wagner remained unperturbed. Why I did this, you will find out later. Is it really only for scientific experimentation? I don't understand what surprises you so, he replied, even if only for the sake of experiment. Strange. When a hurricane hits or a volcano erupts and kills thousands, no one thinks of blaming the volcano. View it as a natural disaster. This answer did not satisfy me. I couldn't help but feel a sense of ill will toward Professor Wagner. You have to be a monster without a heart to condemn millions of people to death for the sake of a scientific experiment, I thought. My dislike of Professor Wagner grew as my own health worsened, and for good reason. This terrible, extraordinary news of a dying world, this ever-accelerating flickering of day and night would unnerve anyone. I had barely slept and was extremely nervous. I had to move with the utmost caution. The slightest muscular effort and I would fly upward and hit my head up on the ceiling, though not very painfully. Things lost their weight and became increasingly difficult to handle. It was enough to accidentally knock against a table or chair, and the heavy furniture would fly off. The water from the sink flowed very slowly, and the stream also deflected to the side. Our movements became jerky. Our limbs, almost weightless, twitched like those of a cardboard clown pulled by strings. Our body's motors, our muscles, proved too strong for the lighter weight. And we couldn't get used to this new position as our weight kept decreasing. Fima, Professor Wagner's housekeeper, was just as angry as I was. She looked like a juggler while cooking. Pots and pans flew up and down. She tried to catch them, making awkward movements, dancing and jumping. Only Professor Wagner was in a good mood and even laughed at us. I only ventured outside with pockets stuffed with stones, lest I fall into the sky. I saw the sea grow shallow. The water was driven west, where it probably flooded the shores. To top it all off, I began to feel dizzy and suffocated. The air became thinner. The hurricane wind, which had been blowing from the east the whole time, seemed to be weakening, but the temperature was rapidly dropping. The air is thinning. The end is coming. I felt so awful that I began to wonder which death I would choose, to fall into the sky or to suffocate. It would be the worst death, but at least I would see what would happen to the earth until the end. No, it's still better to finish right away, I decided, experiencing a heavy suffocation, and began to take the stones out of my pocket. Someone's hand stopped me. Wait, I heard Professor Wagner's voice. It sounded very faint in the thin air. It's time for us to go down to the dungeon. He took my arm, nodded to the housekeeper, who stood on the veranda breathing heavily, and we walked to the corner of the courtyard to a large round window in the ground. I lost my will and walked as if in a dream. Professor Wagner opened the heavy door leading to the underground laboratory and pushed me in. Losing consciousness, I fell softly onto the stone floor.
4. Upside down. I don't know how long I was unconscious. My first sensation was that I was breathing fresh air again. I opened my eyes and was very surprised to see an electric light bulb fixed in the middle of the floor, not far from where I was lying. "Don't be surprised," I heard Professor Wagner's voice. "Our floor will soon become the ceiling. How are you feeling?" "Thank you. Better." "Well, get up. That's enough lying around." He took my hand. I flew up to the glass ceiling and very slowly came back down. "Come on. I'll introduce you to my underground apartment," Professor Wagner said. The entire space consisted of 3 rooms, 2 dark ones lit only by electric bulbs, and 1 large one with a glass ceiling or floor, I'm not sure which. The thing is, we were obviously experiencing that moment when the Earth's gravity and centrifugal force rendered our bodies completely weightless. This made our journey through the rooms extremely difficult. We performed the most extraordinary pirouettes, clinging to furniture, pushing off, jumping, bumping into tables, and sometimes hanging helplessly in the air, holding hands with each other. Only a few centimeters separated us, but we couldn't overcome this space until some clever trick knocked us out of this precarious balance. Things we'd shifted flew along with us. A chair hovered in the middle of the room, glasses of water laid sideways, and the water barely spilled. It gradually flowed around the outer walls of the glass. I noticed the door to the fourth room. Something was humming there, but Professor Wagner wouldn't let me into it. It apparently contained a mechanism that accelerated the Earth's movement. Soon, however, our interplanetary journey ended, and we descended onto the glass ceiling, which was now to become our floor. There was no need to move things, they moved themselves, and the electric lamp mounted on the ceiling conveniently found itself above our heads, illuminating our room during the short nights. Professor Wagner had truly thought of everything. Our quarters were well supplied with air, stored in special tanks. We were well stocked with canned goods and water. That's why the housekeeper didn't go to the market, I thought. Having moved to the ceiling, we walked along it freely as on the floor, although in the normal sense we walked upside down. But a person gets used to everything. I felt relatively well. When I looked down at my feet, through the thick but transparent glass, I saw the sky beneath me, and it seemed as if I were standing on a round mirror, reflecting that sky. However, the mirror sometimes reflected unusual and even terrible things. The housekeeper said that she needed to go into the house because she had forgotten butter. "How are you going to get there?" I said to her. "You'll fall down. I mean, up. Damn it, everything's all mixed up." "I'll hold on to the clamps in the ground. The professor taught me that. Before we were upside down, we had clamps in the ceiling of that house, and I learned to walk with my hands, grabbing them and walking along the ceiling." Professor Wagner has thought of everything. I didn't expect such heroism from a woman. To risk herself, to walk with her hands over an abyss for some oil? "But it's still very dangerous," I said. "Not in the way you think," objected Professor Wagner. "Our body weight is still insignificant. It's only just begun to increase from zero, and very little muscular strength is needed to hold on. Besides, I'll be accompanying her. By the way, I need to grab a notebook from home. I forgot to take it with me." "But there is no air outside now." "I have caps with compressed air that we will put on our heads." And these strange people, donning spacesuits as if they were about to descend to the bottom of the sea, set off. The double doors slammed shut. I heard the slam of the outer door. Lying on my glass floor, I pressed my face against the thick glass and watched them with excitement. Two people in round caps, standing upside down and clinging to brackets attached to the ground, were quickly walking by hand towards the house. Could you imagine anything stranger? It really isn't that bad, I thought. But she's still an extraordinary woman. What if she gets dizzy? Professor Wagner and the housekeeper walked in the same pose up the steps to the veranda and disappeared from view. They soon appeared back. They were already halfway there when something happened that sent a chill through me. The housekeeper dropped a jar of oil and, trying to catch it, fell off and plummeted into the abyss. Professor Wagner made an attempt to save her. He suddenly unwound the rope attached to his belt, hooked it around the bracket, and rushed after the housekeeper. The unfortunate woman fell rather slowly, but since Professor Wagner, with a strong push, accelerated his body, he managed to catch up to her. He reached out to her but couldn't reach her. Centrifugal force deflected her fall slightly. and soon she separated from him. Professor Wagner dangled for a moment from the loose rope and began to slowly rise from the abyss of the sky to the ground. I saw the unfortunate woman wave her arms. Her body was rapidly shrinking. The approaching night, like a curtain, covered this picture of death. I shuddered, imagining her last feelings. What will happen to her? Her corpse, not rotting in the cold of the universe, will rush forever, unless some luminary passing nearby attracts this corpse. I was so busy with my thoughts that I didn't notice Professor Wagner come in and sit down next to me. "A beautiful death," he said calmly. I clenched my teeth and didn't answer him. Suddenly, hatred for Professor Wagner awakened within me again. I gazed in horror at the abyss spreading beneath my feet, and for the first time with extraordinary clarity, I realized that the sky was not a blue expanse above us, but an abyss, that we live in the sky, clinging to a speck of dust, the earth, and therefore could be more rightly called inhabitants of the sky, celestials, than inhabitants of the earth, insignificant celestials. The Earth's gravity obviously acted not only on our bodies, but also on our consciousness, chaining it to the Earth. Now, this connection was broken. I felt the fragility of our earthly existence. Our consciousness was born together with the Earth, in the abysses of the sky, in the abysses of endless space, and there it will fade away. I was thinking, and before my eyes something extraordinary was happening. Stones were breaking off from the ground and falling upwards. Soon whole blocks of rock began to break off. Day and night were changing faster and faster. The sun was racing across the abyss sky, and night was coming. The stars were rushing at the same crazy speed, and again the sun. And again the night. Now in the light of the sun, I see how the fence was torn off and fell, revealing the horizon. I see a dried up seabed, a devastated land. I see that the end is coming soon. But there are still people on Earth. I hear our little loudspeakers speaking radio stations. The Earth is devastated almost to the poles. Everything is perishing. This is the last surviving radio station on Wrangel Island. It sends out signals, waits, and receives no response. Radio waves fly into a dead void. The Earth is silent, and so is the sky. Days and nights follow each other so quickly that everything merges into darkness. The sun, flying across the sky, draws a fiery streak against the dark background. Along with the last remains of the atmosphere, the Earth has lost its blue canopy, the light of the azure sky. The moon has diminished in size, the Earth can no longer support its satellite, and the moon is moving away from the Earth. I feel how thick the glass of our glass floor has become tense, convex, trembling. Soon they won't be able to bear it, and I will fall into the abyss. Who's that grumbling next to me? Ah, Professor Wagner. I struggled to rise. The Earth's furious speed had filled my body with lead. I breathed heavily. "You!" I turned angrily to Professor Wagner. "Why did you do this? You destroyed humanity. You destroyed life on Earth. Answer me. Reduce the Earth's motion immediately, or I—" But the professor silently shook his head. "Answer!" I shouted, clenching my fists. "I can't do anything. I may have made a mistake in my calculations." "Then you will pay for this mistake!" I screamed, and completely mad, I rushed at Professor Wagner and began to strangle him. At that very moment, I felt our floor crack, the glass shatter, and without letting go of Professor Wagner, I fell with him into the abyss.
A new way of teaching. Professor Wagner's smiling face appears before me. I look at him in surprise, then around me. Early morning, a blue canopy of sky. The sea gleams blue in the distance. Two white butterflies flutter peacefully by the veranda. The housekeeper passes me with a large piece of butter on a plate. "What is this? What does all this mean?" I ask the professor. He smiles into his long mustache. "I apologize," he says, "for using you for an experiment without your permission, even without knowing you. If you know me, you probably know that I've long been working on solving the problem of how one person can absorb the vast amount of modern scientific knowledge. For example, I've personally achieved a state where each half of my brain functions independently. I've eliminated sleep and fatigue. I read about it," I replied. Professor Wagner nodded. "All the better. But it's not accessible to everyone. So I decided to use hypnosis for educational purposes. After all, even ordinary pedagogy has a touch of hypnosis. Out for a walk early this morning, I noticed you. Is this your first day tending the juniper bush?" he asked, a cheerful glint in his eyes. I was embarrassed. "Well, I decided to punish you for your curiosity by subjecting you to hypnosis." "What? Did all this really happen?" "Only through hypnosis, from the very moment you saw me. Didn't you experience it all as if it were real? And of course, you'll never forget it. So you had the opportunity to receive a visual lesson in the laws of gravity and centrifugal force. But you turned out to be a very nervous student, and towards the end of the lesson, you behaved somewhat excitedly. But how long did the lesson last?" Professor Wagner looked at his watch. 2 minutes, no more. A productive way to learn, isn't it? "But wait," I cried. "This glass window, these brackets on the ground." I extended my hand and suddenly fell silent. The courtyard was completely flat. There were no brackets, no round glass window. So this was also hypnosis? "Well, of course. Admitted, you weren't very bored during my physics lesson. Mrs. Fema, is the coffee ready? Let's go have breakfast."